Hello and welcome to the online content for our series, our worship series, The Foundations of Worship. So, to give you a little bit of a heads up, in the series we are going to have 7 Sunday sermons and 6 online content messages. And I want to encourage you, the purpose of this recording and you watching it is not for you to just watch something and at the end of it kind of go, that was interesting. The idea behind this is for you to share the content with somebody. So maybe you're in a life group, maybe you want to share it with a group of colleagues or friends when you meet together and you're having a cup of coffee or whatever. But the best benefit you'll get out of this is to share it with somebody.
And we're looking at quite an interesting concept. We're looking at worship, but we're looking at worship, how it starts right at the beginning of the Bible.
Yeah.
The first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. In fact, some of those books are one where we get stuck with our Bible reading plans at the beginning of the year. And we're hoping that as we go to these 5 books, which were written by Moses, we're going to see what worship looked like at the beginning of the Bible and what we can learn from it. But more than head knowledge, I really want to encourage you to apply these principles to your life.
Yeah.
Because it's not just about learning something new, even though there's some new interesting things that we've learned in preparing. It's about how it changes our lives. If you haven't already done so, I want to encourage you to connect with our Sunday message. We looked at our first principle, which is that worship means giving something to God. And we've also chosen a memory verse for each week. And I want to encourage you to connect with those verses, put them somewhere where you can see them regularly until it's become something that's stored in your heart. And we've looked at our very first memory verse for the series, which comes from Romans 10 verse 13. For everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. And that's something that we're going to be looking at in a little bit more depth, where this concept comes from. But I also want to encourage you in your daily times to go and have a look at our weekly Bible readings to make sure that you get an overview of the key events in the first 5 books of the Bible. But let's go right back to the beginning, to Genesis.
Yes, well, when we talk about Genesis, and it's the first book of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, the characters there are obvious. It's Adam and Eve, right?
Right.
So I think what we need to do is just get a little bit of a background on the book of Genesis and the story of Adam and Eve, because I think that'll give everybody some context to what we're talking about. So first of all, we're going to kick off with Adam and Eve no longer being in the garden. So we are cutting out everything that happened in the garden. Our story of worship actually starts from our context when they've left the garden. They've been kicked out of the garden because they sinned against God. And they have 2 sons, Cain and Abel. And by the way, next Sunday, you will be listening to a very, very good sermon on Cain and Abel and how their lives depicted worship, how God used their story to tell us, to give us a very powerful worship principle. But after Abel's death, because in the story, Cain kills his brother. After Abel's death, Cain wanders off with a lot of bitterness and resentment in his heart. And evil follows him. But he finds a wife, and she bears him a son called Enoch. And Enoch, it starts with Enoch, and then 4 generations later, and in a society of normalized evil, which is quite a scary thought, isn't it? Lamech is Cain's final descendant, and he, of course, perishes in the flood during the time of Noah, and now we're going to Genesis chapter 6. But the death of Cain's lineage does not mean the end of Adam's legacy. And this is where the good news comes in, because after the death of Abel, God gave Adam and Eve another son. So let's pick it up from Genesis chapter 4, verse 25. It says, Adam had sexual relations with his wife again, and she gave birth to another son. She named him Seth. For she said, God has granted me another son in place of Abel, whom Cain killed. When Seth grew up, he had a son and named him Enosh. At that time, people first began to worship the Lord by name. Now, this is a very interesting statement around Enosh. The word worship there in the Hebrew language actually means to call upon or to proclaim the name of the Lord. It's a very interesting word for worship, and which brings us to our second principle that we want to discuss in the series, and that is that worship means calling on the name of the Lord.
And I think it's so interesting if you consider what did they know about worship. And we know that when Adam and Eve left the garden, there was that very first sacrifice, that blood sacrifice.
Yeah.
And they knew that worshiping God involved sacrifice. God gave them the covering of skin. And so they knew that worship included sacrifice. And we're going to get to that principle a little bit later in the series. But they learned to call on the name of the Lord. Now, Adam and Eve had quite a close relationship with God in the garden.
Yes.
And then there was that time of separation. And they taught Seth, who in turn taught Enosh, to call on the name of the Lord, to proclaim the name of the Lord. And that's that word that you've just mentioned to us, that Hebrew word kara b'shem, to invoke or proclaim the name of the Lord. And now if we have a look at the name Enosh, a lot of biblical words biblical names have quite a lot of significance behind them, but Enosh simply means man. And perhaps Seth was acknowledging the frailty of man and his need for God, and that inspired him to worship God faithfully. And I think it's so important that we realize who we are. We're just people.
We're just people.
And
we're
we
ordinary
need
people.
to call on the name of the Lord.
Yeah.
There's that understanding that there is a higher being. There's somebody who's more powerful. There's a creator. And as soon as we call out to him, we're saying we acknowledge that he can help us. And I think that's so powerful if we're looking at that context of, or the concept of calling on the name of the Lord.
Just also interesting, for the sake of the historical reference and the genealogy that we spoke about earlier, is that Seth's son Enosh actually became the forefather of Noah. And when we read the Bible, we actually discover that Noah was the forefather of King David. And of course, King David was the forefather of Jesus Christ himself. So there's the lineage that comes through. And what plays such an important role is the fact that worship becomes public. Worship becomes something that is way more public than what it was just personal during this time. And in every historical timeline of mankind, evil may flourish.
Yeah.
As it was in this time, you find, I mean, this is pre-flood. Evil was flourishing, but what's so beautiful about this passage is that even when evil flourishes, worship will never, ever be sidelined. Yes, worship will never, ever be sidelined. In fact, worship will not just survive, but worship will actually thrive. And that's the essence of this message. That's the essence of this passage of Scripture. And in the midst of the most evil times in human history, people actually began to organize themselves in groups with one specific goal, and that is to worship God. And I think that is absolutely beautiful. The introduction of worship as a public practice was significant because it placed the practice of worship as a fundamental value for the well-being of society.
And so, despite having left the garden where Adam and Eve had intimate relationships with God, they were able to continue that lineage and that relationship through Seth, their second son, who replaced Abel. And so we see that practice of worship and connecting with God is so integral. And then it contrasts sharply with Cain, who did not worship, because it says specifically that they were sinful, and that led to the flood. And now this Hebrew word, is found in some other places. I want to share one of those with you. I think one of the most well-known is in Joel 2 verse 32, where it says, "It shall come to pass that everyone who calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved." And that's that same Hebrew word, korah b'shem, where you're calling out or proclaiming the name of the Lord, which leads to salvation. And this is the same verse that's quoted in Acts 2:21, when the disciples first share the good news, where they say, everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. And that's, as you would have gathered, also our memory verse for this week in Romans 10 verse 9. And I want to read the whole passage to you from Romans just to get the context there. "If you openly declare that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. For it is by believing in your heart that you are made right with God, and it is by openly declaring your faith that you are saved. As the scriptures tell us, anyone who trusts in him will never be disgraced. Jew and Gentile are the same in this respect. They have the same Lord who gives generously to all who call on him. For everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved."
And that is absolutely beautiful. And what an incredible verse to memorize, to always remember, because we live in a society where we are confronted by evil all day long. And it is a reminder that when I feel intimidated, I feel scared, I feel fearful, I need to just worship. Worship brings my soul out of the darkness and a place of despair. It's a beautiful and a powerful tool. And I think what will make this really helpful is to consider a few questions for discussion that will help you understand the concept better, is to really unpack it in a discussion format. So let's start with a few questions. Here's the first one. Consider the world we live in. I just spoken about that a few minutes ago. Consider the world we live in. What is about society, local and global, that concerns you the most right now? I think what's so helpful is, before we get to a place where we can recognize God's goodness in worship, is to actually be honest with ourselves and say, these are the things that I'm fearful of right now. These are the things that worry me for myself, my home, my family, my future, what it is. So take a moment and discuss the things that you are fearful of the most.
And then number 2, how do these concerns impact your ability or capacity to worship God in spite of the realities of the world around you? And that's that concept of calling out to God. And it also includes proclaiming him, saying he is my God. As we show that we are people who believe in God.
Well, yes, 2 more. Number 3, discuss how worship and calling on the name of the Lord, that's the main topic here. Discuss how worship and calling on the name of the God can be the catalyst to bringing perspective, hope, peace, and even possible solutions to these concerns.
And then lastly, question number 4. Our Sunday message highlighted that worship means giving something to God. And maybe take a few minutes to talk about what stood out for you from that message. And so I want to say thank you for joining us. Thank you for taking the time to consider these passages. I hope that you're going to be encouraged by these principles as we work through them together, and that we're going to understand the foundations and the principles of worship from the first few books of the Bible.